All right, guys, this screencastify is going to go over Chapter 1, Reading 1, Introduction to Psychology and the Evolution of Psychology. So I'm just going to jump into it. You ready? Take a look at the image on the screen. You can hit pause and go back into Google Meet, and in the comment section, write down what you see. Now, I'm going to guess that most of you said you saw a tiger. And there's something very tiger-like about this image. There's eyes, there's nose, there's a mouth, and our mind searches for faces. But if you notice, hidden in the picture are three faces, and there is no tiger. The tiger is an illusion. It is a construction of your mind. And Salvador Dali, the person who painted this image, was making a comment about the subjectivity of human experience, which is a major idea in psychology. So the title of this work is 50 Abstract Paintings, which is, as seen from 2 yards, change into 3 Lenins, masquerading as Chinese, and as seen from 6 yards, appear to be the head of a Royal Bengal tiger. And that is a quick introduction to some of the themes that we're going to be talking about today. In this class, you're going to learn a bunch of theories about how the mind works. But psychology is still in its infancy, and there's many questions that we still need to answer. And the goal of the class is to ask good questions and then evaluate the quality of those answers. So what is psychology? Psychology comes from the word psyche, which means the soul or the mind or the self, and logos, which means to study. So psychology is the study of the mind, and it comes to be the study of the mind and behavior. So psychology emerged from philosophy and physiology, and I believe that those are two vocab terms from your reading guide that you should have been able to define. So philosophy is the study of knowledge, and physiology is the study of the body. So you should have those two definitions written down somewhere. So what did philosophy contribute to psychology? Philosophy uses reason and logic to propose and answer difficult questions. And physiology is the study of how the body functions, and it relies on direct observation and the scientific method. All right, here are the three great questions of philosophy that were actually published in an article in Psychology Today. So this will get us started. What is philosophy? Well, one question is, what is knowledge? How do we know what we know? For example, you might have been very sure that you were looking at a picture of a tiger, but you weren't. You were looking at a picture of squares and triangles. Your mind created a tiger that was not there. Another great question of philosophy is, how should we conduct ourselves? What is appropriate behavior in a civil society? And how should we govern ourselves? So in psychology, we will keep running into philosophical questions that guided scientific research and are still interesting to psychologists today. So do people have free will? Are you going to school because you want to go to school? Or are you going to school because somebody's making you go to school? And could you leave if you wanted to? If you're hungry, don't you go and eat? So we will always run into this question of free will. Some psychologists think that people have a great deal of agency and can learn to have more agency. And some psychologists think that people are really slaves to their body or to their environment. Another question is, are people naturally good or evil? How do we know that the world around us is real if it is filtered through the lenses of our mind? And another question that we'll play around with today is the mind created by the brain, or do people have a soul that is independent from our biology? So those are questions that science can't really answer. And what's cool about psychology is we keep running into them, which is why there's so many controversies in the field of psychology. So, main idea, philosophy gave psychology its guiding questions. The early pioneers in psychology were looking for scientific and observable ways to answer ancient questions about what it means to be human. And it's not uncommon for modern psychologists to reference philosophical debates in scientific papers. You see it all the time. And by the way, without realizing it, my dog just walked in. I just started petting her. So she wanted me to pet her, so I pet her. So who is the dog and who is the owner? And do we really have free will? Your reading guide mentions dualism, and we're going to come back to it later in class, but you can write down as a definition for dualism that it's the idea that the mind and the body are separate from each other. You might need to pause for a second and just jot that down in your reading guide. This seems like a religious idea because, after all, the soul is independent from the body in a lot of religious traditions. But later in the presentation, I'm going to show you a very modern take on this question. It's kind of cool. So we'll come back to Rene Descartes and his idea that I think, therefore I am. All right, so we're almost done this section on physiology. I just want to show you what physiology is. So if you're studying anatomy and how the body works, you're studying physiology. And so technology has changed in the past 50, 100 years to give us great advances in our ability to study physiology. So the study of physiology influenced the study of psychology because psychology is a science that relies on direct observation and measurement to study the mind and behavior. So we use the tools that a biologist would use to study the body, but we're studying the interaction between the brain and the body and the mind. The first psychologists were interested in the physiology of the senses and began to use scientific method to study the way the brain detects and interprets light, touch, and sound. I'll show you a little bit about that in a second. All right. This is not in the notes, but it's interesting. There's a related field to physiology, and it's evolutionary psychology. So when psychologists begin to ask, how did human beings become the way we are over time? How did genetics affect the mind and behavior? Then you're talking about evolutionary psychology. And an early person to talk about this was Charles Darwin, who developed the theory of natural selection. And if you look at these quotes, basically what he's saying is, in the second quote, which is a little bit hidden, it says, the highest possible stage in moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts. And so Darwin's implying that as a species, we evolved to have self-awareness, which is something that we're very interested in psychology. He's talking about free will. It's a philosophical question. All right. It's been 10 minutes. I think I need 5 more to complete this little presentation, so bear with me. I'm going to go fast because this is easy stuff that's in your notes. You can pause it if you need to write something down. Wilhelm Wundt played a key role in the development of psychology as a distinct field. He was a German physiologist. He's considered the father of modern psychology. He sought to develop an empirical way, an observable way to study the mind, and he set up the first formal psych lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. So that is all you need to know about Wilhelm Wundt. If you asked me one of the things he discovered, I couldn't tell you. All he did was he set up a psych lab and became the world's first psychologist. G. Stanley Hall brought psychology to America, specifically Johns Hopkins. And everything that happens in this class is based on the American Psychological Association standards for teaching. And G. Stanley Hall set up that organization, which is still with us today. There are 3 early perspectives to psychology, and we're just going to talk about 2 of them. We're going to talk about structuralism and functionalism. Um, Today, these all fall under cognitive psychology, which I think I wrote down in the notes somewhere. Cognition just means thinking, and the structuralists and the functionalists set up cognitive psychology. So, to your book wrote this down, and it does not make any sense. The task of psychology is to identify the smallest possible elements of the mind. Now, what does that mean? Not much. I'll show you what it means in a second. Now, what they did was they used a tool called introspection, where they would train people to experience, different sensory experiences and and describe those experiences in very objective ways so that they could be recorded. So that was an early research technique that they were developing to study the mind. All right, so Wilhelm Wundt and Edward Titchener were early structuralists. Let me show you what they were studying. Did you know that the average person can see a candle flame seen at 30 miles on a clear, dark night? 50% of the time. So that's the threshold. Well, how do they know that? Well, Wundt and Titchener must have sent somebody out into the countryside 30 miles away with a stopwatch and told them, and a pen and paper, and told them to write down every time they saw a candle flame. You can hear the tick of a watch under quiet conditions at 20 feet. So again, they did experiments and figured out that the average person can hear that 50% of the time. And you can taste 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water 50% of the time. So what they're doing here is they're looking at the senses and trying to figure out what is the greatest sensitivity of each of the human senses. And that was the beginning of psychology. Kind of boring, but there's a chapter that we're going to talk about, that we're going to study, called Sensation and Perception. And it's actually interesting. And half of the chapter was discovered by the structuralists, and then the rest was discovered by the functionalists and Gestalt psychologists. Functionalists, um, led by by William James, was heavily influenced by the theory of evolution, and they believed that natural selection favored behavior that ensures survival. And they were interested in the purpose of behavior. They were interested in cognition. They founded modern applied and cognitive psychology. William James wrote psychology's first textbook. It says that in the margin, or there's a picture of it in the margin of your reading guide. All right, so, oh, sweet, I'm almost done. I copied something twice. Um, Take a look at this quote by William James. He wrote, "The stream of thought flows on, but most of its segments fall into the bottomless abyss of oblivion." Right now, if you're bored, you're experiencing that, because 5 minutes from now, you're not going to remember anything that I said unless you write it down. Of some, no memory survives the instant of their passage. Of others, it is confined to a few moments, hours, or days. Others again leave vestiges which are indestructible, and by means of which they may be recalled as long as life endures. So on your reading guide, it says stream of consciousness, and what he's talking about is memory and self-awareness, which is something that we will talk about in great detail. And from my perspective, the question is, how do we learn? How do we remember? And how do we retain what we've learned for a long period of time? Um, the structuralists were interested in education, and your textbook mentions John Dewey, and John Dewey still influences education today. So if you take a look at this picture, it's showing how a child's environment changes as they get older, which changes the way they think. And that is a really modern way of thinking about how the brain develops. All right, so summary. Structuralists were physiologists who were interested in understanding how the senses interacted with the mind. Functionalists were more like modern applied psychologists who wanted to understand the purpose of consciousness and how to improve learning. I'm going to stop here because it's been a while, and I want to get back into Google Classroom. So we will look at behaviorism together and watch a video. So you can stop and rejoin Google Meet.